It's called public service for a reason, not public self-interest.
If you're a pastor, you have insight into some of the hardships and could put some pieces together in a way that some of us who are in different types of occupations might not.
How can we step into those positions to serve the least of these, to be a voice for those people?
Welcome to Parish, a video podcast that celebrates, equips, and focuses on small churches and why they matter so much. We believe that small churches are uniquely positioned to integrate in their communities and engage issues in ways only small churches can. I'm your host, Kaitlyn Hurst, and this is episode 3, Politics, Presence and Practice, Part 2. In this episode, we pick up right where we left off with Chelsea Noonenkamp and Hannah Paul to continue our discussion about how the small church can humbly engage in politics for the love of our neighbor. Chelsea, you are an elected official. You obviously chose that for a very intentional reason. I think the church, I don't know, somewhere in the middle kind of decided it was cool to say we shouldn't try to grab for power, but also at the same time, like, hope that our politicians believed everything we believed. So from a historical perspective and a biblical perspective, what did it look like to actually be a politician? And then why have you chosen to do that?
Yeah, no, it's such a good question, and not necessarily an easy process, right? It's something that I navigated with prayer and with wise counsel and, is this the right time for me to run? But initially, the value proposition of running for office is, I don't even see it as taking on a position of power that I'm wielding over others, but as the role of a public servant, right? It's called public service for a reason, not public self-interest. And so how am I stepping into a role that is truly laying down my life and sacrificing a lot of time and things to serve other people around me and my actual neighbors? And you can see that throughout history and throughout scripture, where people were put in key positions of authority to advocate for those around them, right? We see that for Joseph in Pharaoh's palace, where he's elevated to this area of power that actually enables him to provide for the entire region throughout a famine, right? We see it for Esther, who's placed in this position of influence and authority, and she's able to advocate for the preservation of the entire Jewish people. And so for believers, when we see opportunities to step into areas of influence, I think we have to have the frame and the lens of, we're not doing it for our own name, for our own identity, our own personal privilege or power, but how can we step into those positions to serve the least of these, to be a voice for those people, and then also to model for the community around us what it looks like to live your faith out in the public sphere, right? The idea that my faith is personal, but it's not private. It's not a secret from anyone, but I'm also not passing ordinances that are trying to impose my own personal value system on an entire community, but rather to establish a social context where people who can thrive and live in their own kind of identities as people who are made in the image of God. The other thing that I'll add to that is a scripture that was a real touchstone for me in the campaign was from Jeremiah 29. And it talks about, they're in captivity, or they're in exile. And he's giving them instructions on how to live. And he says, plant gardens, have families. And he says, seek the peace of the place that you're in. Seek the shalom of the city. For in its peace, or in its welfare, depending on the translation, you will also find your own peace and your own welfare. And my role is to seek the peace of the place that I'm in, to seek the peace and the welfare of the city of Inglewood. And I will tell you, it's also been the most spiritually formative thing I've ever done in my entire life. It's been hard and challenging and, revealed areas where I maybe have an insecurity or, sin or whatever, but you're in this position to say, okay, Holy Spirit, how do I listen to you well? How do I operate with wisdom and seek the peace and the welfare of this place?
And kind of the idea too is it's okay to not, and we kind of shouldn't hold people to a standard, people who are not Christians to necessarily the exact standard of being a believer, right? Or of saying, we can't achieve all the goals of the kingdom of God. We're not directly making disciples through political channels, so it's not worth it. Like that's an extremely flawed, but I think an extremely popular position right now.
Yeah.
You know?
I think too, alongside of that, we can often think about our political leaders as almost like we treat them in a way we wouldn't treat somebody that we interact with on a day-to-day basis. And we speak ill of them, and we, to use some biblical language, we curse them. And when what we should be doing, right, is to be praying for them, and not praying for them to necessarily do what we want them to do, but praying for their well-being, praying for their safety, praying for them to have the courage to make the decision that is the hard, but the one that's good for the most people, you know, those sorts of things. And I think just even going back to ways to get involved, like starting by praying for, especially if you have a hard heart or you're triggered when you think about people in office, especially if you think about it at the national level, like start praying for them, and that'll probably change some stuff in how you're thinking about them as well.
Like advice for small church leaders, build it into your liturgy. If you don't have any written prayers, do it. Or you don't have to do that. It's something that we've done in our church because it gives voice and consistency and rhythm to a prayer for our elected officials. But it doesn't have to be written out and super liturgical or anything, but just pray out loud in church as a community for them. Simply, that's one of the easiest things that you can do to start. And if we profess to believe that prayer is powerful, why are we not doing that?
It's also really hard to have your heart hard towards someone when you're consistently praying for them.
Yes.
It's just
That's a
really a hard thing to do. And something that I think is really helpful. And when we talk about, you know, the idea of legislating our beliefs or some of those concerns, I think what's also helpful to remember is some of the downfall of the way that the church has engaged politically and civically is by being too outcome oriented, that we have sometimes believed that the ends justify the means. As long as we get what we want in the end, we can play as dirty as the world, seek as much power, at the exploitation of others, right? And at the cost of others, if we're on this mission, but we forget that we are living within the context of the gospel and we're serving the king of an upside down kingdom who never approached power in the way that the world did, right? He was always turning it on its head. And for some of the people who have seen that, and I think, you know, I could put myself in this at different points in my career and in my life of recognizing those concerns and saying, oh, I don't want anything to do with that. And to those people who would say, you know what, I think maybe Christians are too political right now, to say it's not that Christians are too political, it's that our politics have become insufficiently Christian, that we are not carrying the character and the way of Jesus into how we're operating in this space, and that if we, as Hannah said earlier, remember the really basic things that we already know how to do, the fruits of the Spirit, right? If we were operating in that space with kindness and love and joy and faithfulness to God and to one another, how would that change how we interact and change the way we do the work is just as important as the outcomes that they produce.
I love that. I think that's so well said. And I think remembering that how much character matters, first and foremost, in how we are engaging with other people. And also as we're discerning, you know, whom to support as well. That's another conversation I think that we've both come across a lot of. I don't like how this person or this candidate, and this could be at any level of government, right? It's easy to think of national level examples, but I don't love how this person behaves or how they treat people, but I like some of the policies, right? I think, and they're willing to make that bargain. And I would just encourage folks to pause and think about how much character matters and how that's an essential part of our witness and our reputation. And if we are sort of engaging in the public sphere, right, we are reflecting on what it is to be, to follow in the way of Jesus. And like Chelsea was saying, like if those aren't the fruits of the Spirit or a way of living that reflects, you know, what we learn through the Sermon on the Mount, then like something's probably off and we might need to recalibrate. I think something that we did in the class, that's a really good thing to sort of maybe identify some blind spots, because we all have them, is to reflect on your sort of previous experiences in politics. Like, what has politics meant to you? How was it presented to you? What have you learned is the way to participate in politics? And for some people, that's like a really specific thing. in order to be a Christian, I have to be a member of this party. I have to vote in this way. I can't be a member of a party if I'm a Christian. Like all these different narrow understandings of what it means to be a Christian and to participate or not in politics. And I think it's good to reflect on those because it can identify some areas where, we might have some own work and reflection and possibly repentance to do, which is important before we sort of start engaging with people or trying to affect issues.
That plays exactly into kind of the next thing I want to talk about, which is legitimate fears that church leaders have kind of surrounding encouraging engagement in this way. Now, of course, like you mentioned, some leaders are like, these are the only channels we're going to, like, you can't be a Christian unless you're this or that, which is obviously the wrong way to look at it. A lot of people I know and have heard on a variety of different channels talking about it is 2020, for example, 2016 was such a contentious time. We were too liberal for the conservative folks. We were too conservative for the liberal folks. Everyone was mad at each other, and then beyond that, a lot of leaders seeing just the idolization of party. Let's talk about what political idols are, because a lot of people kind of define it as, well, it's just something we love a little bit too much. But actually, the reality is it's something that ends up demanding something from us, sacrifices from us, just like in the Old Testament, right? So let's talk about what these fears are for leaders and how to navigate and overcome them.
I mean, the first thing I would say is just to validate, like, that's a valid fear.
Yes.
It's a tough time. And then also to remind folks that it's not the only time that we've had this kind of challenge throughout the Christian witness of the church and throughout history, right? And so just to remember that this is not a unique time, but it is a challenging one. And whether you're in a context where, maybe everyone in your church is from kind of the same political perspective, if you're a red state or a blue state, or if you have a lot of political diversity in your church, it really doesn't matter in our perspective how you approach it. The main things that are important is to have the lens of discipleship, that we need political discipleship in this moment for followers of Jesus. And unfortunately, we haven't really received that in the modern church. And so the things, the way that our parties and our ideologies become idols is when they're not questioned, and if we can't look at our kind of political ideology and name the things where it falls short, the ways where it falls short, or where it's out of step with the way of Jesus, then we can acknowledge that that's an idol and that it's taken too big of a place in our affections. And so the key is to help train people to be flexible with their political ideologies and inflexible with the ideology of Jesus, and to hold those things together, to acknowledge that there is political diversity probably within your congregation, to help people feel kind of seen and known that it's probably not homogenous, and that's okay. But then also to help folks know that these are not salvific issues, these are not ultimate issues, and it's not about disagreeing less, it's about teaching folks to disagree better, right? And so how do we bring some of those values to the conversation? So where maybe there's intimidation around, like, do I have to get this policy right? Or am I going to kind of kick this partisan hornet's nest? It's not about taking a side or having to have the right wonky policy solution. It's really about how do we live as followers of Jesus in all of our actions in this space unto the reconciliation of all things.
What I'm hearing is like holding disagreement well and disagreeing better actually is showing that you place more emphasis on God's kingdom than on the political sphere. You're not putting all your hope in that. I think people's fear, it's kind of ironic, of engaging is like, well, there's so much disagreement and so much divisiveness, but actually creating space for that elevates God's kingdom. And
yes. And I don't think there's no biblical mandate that I can think of that tells us, and you must agree on all things, or if we even look at Jesus's disciples, right? We had a zealot and we had a tax collector, and they were eating around the same table and they were following Jesus together, and they were united in that, even though their political beliefs and their positions in society were radically different. I would say even more different than we might see, between a Democrat and Republican today. And so there is space for that. There's space for that political diversity that that Chelsea was speaking to. And I think it's also important to acknowledge that, no political party or platform or candidate can ever fully encompass Christian values or the Christian way, right? All of these things are imperfect. All of these things have major issues, right? Parties are great tools. They're really efficient ways, right, to influence politics, and they're not a bad thing in and of themselves. But they can never fully embody the way of Jesus. And so if we are trying to put all of that on a party or a person, then we're going to run into issues of political idols really quickly, or run into issues of putting partisanship or putting political ideology above a broader sort of Christian way of living. And that's where we get into trouble. I will also say it's something that you always have to sort of keep a check on or keep an eye on, right? It's so easy to slip in or to allow a political point of view or a policy that you, especially if you really care about it, to then supersede maybe the way that you're engaging with other people on that topic, or slipping into that, well, the ends do justify the means for this particular thing, right? It's important to be, Chelsea and I have both engaged in conversations with each other. Like, we have different ideological leanings. And so even in our conversations, we've been able to identify areas in which we've needed to repent because we have put party or put a policy above a Christian-like approach.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Like in our churches, so many people have learned to hate the other side, not explicitly stated usually, but that's what ends up happening.
Yeah.
And it's so simple, but if we would focus on the love your enemies commandment, things would look a lot different.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree.
Absolutely. And like, that's good too, because for a while I was wondering if I was, as I started to develop more of an opinion politically, and again, that was a privilege that I got to choose to develop a political opinion engagement, where people who are more affected by policies and procedures, it's not an option for them. But during that time, I was realizing, like, holding two things that seemed kind of diametrically opposed was, I'm politically pretty liberal and theologically in some ways pretty conservative. And that's okay.
Mm-hmm.
Like, that's an okay thing.
Yes.
So I feel like a lot of people are kind of fearful of that it would turn into that, and that those things would kind of war, inside of them.
I think too, especially because there can be so much fear attached to, like, are we going to still belong here if we share this thing about myself? And for a lot of people, it's a political ideology or a way we think about politics that might go against what we perceive to be the mainstream way of thinking in our communities. And this is especially, I think, a good thing for pastors to keep in mind as well. Something that Chelsea and I were talking about yesterday was not to make any assumptions about how people believe or how people would like to practice politics or do practice politics. I think once you talk to a person, you very quickly realize it's much more nuanced. And oftentimes people will surprise you. And it's not uncommon to have people who are in a minority group, I would say, politically in a congregation as well. And so to be mindful of that and to give space for all of those folks.
Yeah. Just the fact that you're both, I think one of the first things you said in our growth group was, we come from different ends of the political spectrum in a lot of ways. And I knew at that point that you were best friends. And unfortunately, that's so rare. I was kind of shocked, to be totally honest. And so I think that's really beautiful. And to share to people, like, you can differ in a lot of ways politically, and like absolutely love one another.
Yeah. And that our differences, from my perspective, haven't made our friendship harder, because at the end of the day, like, we agree on the outcomes that we want to see in our society. We want to see, we want to see justice and freedom and safety and prospering. And where we don't always agree is about how we get there. And that's, much like that's not as big of a deal as if we stay focused on kind of like we're both here for the same reasons.
And I think what's helpful too is, I know Hannah, I know her value system, I know her love for Jesus. And so we have developed so much relational equity that if we do have a disagreement on a policy, we typically meet it with curiosity,
Yes.
I would say, to one another versus, oh, this might be the end of this relationship. We have enough of a foundation that it's easy. And I think in going back to the small church context, when you have a smaller community and the ability not only to build that equity with each other, then also with people in like your civic community, you are able to navigate disagreement so much easier because these are not going to be like, well, I'm leaving the church issue, or someone said something from the stage. I've never had an actual conversation with them. All I know is that we disagree on this issue, so I can't be here anymore, or now I have an offense. And when it's actually like, well, no, I know this person, I know their values, I know what they care about, we're able to work through those things and model it for the community and political society around us.
Yeah. And I think if you're in the small church the small church context, not perspective, but maybe that works too. It also helps because if something is said from the stage or by somebody you have a conversation with after church, right? It's a lot easier to follow up with them about that. It's a lot easier if Nathan were to say something in his homily or Maggie were to say something during her homily and that kind of raised a flag, you can go talk to them about it, right? And that's a good thing to do. It's a good thing, go in, try not to come in real hot and aggressive, right? But be like, hey, you said this thing and wow, that really made me feel this way. Can we talk more about that? And that is a really great thing that small churches can do super well.
Yeah,
Absolutely. That's what they talked about in our first episode was like, people have access to me because there's not an overwhelming amount. Like I have capacity to know everyone's name and at least have coffee semi-regularly with everyone who calls this church, our place. And that's one of the unique kind of positionings the small church has. There's an elementary school that in the building we used to meet was a block away. And the plan was the city council at the time, this was in 2016, I believe, was unanimous about tearing down the school and moving locations farther away. But the truth was a lot of kids who went to that school came from families who did not have means of transportation. Parents had to work and kind of relied on the close proximity to the school in order to get their kids there on time and everything. There were a lot of factors that the city council actually just didn't consider because they didn't know about it. And by being integrated in the neighborhood and small enough to have the time to know your neighbors and the parishioners, you could say, he and his wife knew like this is going to negatively affect like moving this school for really not very many reasons other than to find a new location really is going to affect the kids who go here in a really negative way. And they spoke at a city council meeting and advocated for these people, and it switched that very night, I believe, from unanimous let's tear it down and move it to let's tear it down and rebuild it in the same exact place. Because that was the idea. It was really out of date, and they needed to have a new place. But that saved so many neighbors the hassle of trying to figure out how to get their kids to another place or, for a variety of reasons. Even the school provided lunch during the summer for families who maybe couldn't afford groceries. I mean, it was really important for the community, not just proximity. But
I love that story, and it reminds me of a superpower, I guess, of pastors, which is that they are closely involved in understanding the lives and the challenges of the people in their congregation. And so if you're a pastor, you have insight into some of the hardships and could put some pieces together in a way that some of us who are in different types of occupations might not. And so a pastor could have some special insight that they could bring right to a city council meeting or some other public forum, right, that people in other types of occupations might not see.
The other thing that I think is helpful about that, and I've heard Nathan tell that story before, is that he and Julie obviously led that charge, but they actually didn't do it alone. They brought people along with them. They showed a path to say, and to let people know, hey, this is happening in our community. This is the survey you can take online. This is when the public meeting is. We can go give public comment. And for leaders and shepherds of communities, it's how do you show your community this is the path for how we actually can show influence here and how we can be an advocate here, and follow, come do it with me. Right.
Mm-hmm.
And we talked earlier about some of that intimidation about maybe not knowing how to navigate a system or feeling like would never want to go speak at a public meeting by myself, but to do it together, to bring folks along with you. Other civic institutions do that all the time. And we sometimes forget that the church is actually a civic institution in a community. And when, as an elected official, when we think about potential partners we have in the community, houses of worship and faith are always part of that conversation because they do have so much social power with the people who are associated with them.
Yeah, absolutely. Hannah, you mentioned that a lot of your work is studying and engaging in issues of immigration.
Mm-hmm.
Really curious about that. That seems and is, it seems like and actually is a huge, weighty national level problem.
Mm-hmm.
But the truth is it plays out in local communities
Mm-hmm.
with individuals
Yeah.
and families all over the place,
Yes.
oftentimes under the noses of people who are privileged enough to not have to know about it.
Mm-hmm.
So let's talk about that and, a little bit about that system and how small churches with limited resources
Mm-hmm.
and people and everything can find those things in their
Mm-hmm.
communities and help to bring justice.
Yes. Wow. Okay. I'm so excited because there are so many things I could talk about here. So I think almost any American, right, could look at or any person living in the United States could look at the U.S. immigration system and say there's some issues here, right? This has been it's a salient topic, right? It's one that's in the headlines. It's an issue, right, that most people could identify in relation to politics. And it's tricky too because immigration is a national level issue, right? There are some ways in which state and local governments can influence immigration processes, right? We've even seen in the last few years, like some governors try to throw in their weight and try to influence that process a little bit more. But in order for real meaningful change to happen to immigration policy, it has to happen at the national level, which makes it a lot trickier for us to see changes, even though the American public there's a lot of agreement on the types of changes that we'd like to see. So acknowledging the difficult national level issues with immigration, ways that people at the local level can help. So there have been larger influxes of people who were forced to migrate from their home country. So people who are refugees, people who are asylum seekers, for example. And something to keep in mind in the U.S. context is that there is very little support given to people really of any background, immigration background, once they immigrate, right? So they're not given lots of funds or resources. And so it's really often on the community that they're in or nonprofit organizations and churches to help get them integrated into their new home and how things work here. For folks who have undocumented status, that ways that we could help people from that background, right, is connecting them, helping them pay for lawyers, right? Immigration is so expensive. And if you're coming from a context, right, when you don't have a lot of wealth, it's really challenging to
Can you break that down?
Yeah.
Because I think a lot of people know it's expensive,
Yes.
but I think a lot of people don't know why.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So there are just a lot of fees that go along with the paperwork process. And if there's any sort of contestation involved in your case, if you're one of the lucky people, right, who are able to get their application accepted in some form or fashion, and there's some sort of issue that needs to be clarified, right, it often requires a lawyer. And if you are, say, seeking asylum, that means your case is going to be heard in court, right? And so oftentimes for that process to go well for you, you need some sort of legal representation. And that's also expensive. There are some amazing organizations, some in this Denver area, that do great pro bono work or offer the services, but they'll tell you they are overworked and there is so much need that they are unable to meet. And so coming together and pooling resources to help folks. And then there are other ways, right? I'm focusing more on like people with more vulnerable backgrounds. But I have lots of friends, just having been, working on my PhD for the last 6 years. A lot of my friends and my colleagues in that space are international students. And so there have been some significant policy changes that affected their livelihoods over the last few years that caused them a lot of anxiety, really affected their lives, and they were not in positions to advocate in the same way that some of us who had citizenship were. And so partnering with them to engage in advocacy is also a really big deal, and something that any person can do as well. And like I said earlier, like doing it in a way that's amplifying their voices, and not speaking for them. So there's a few ways there that I've thrown out where we can engage in that issue. And I think this is something too, we can even look back at scripture and see lots of precedent for loving neighbor, which includes like the person who's a stranger in the land that we're in, right? To use some old school language, and to remember that people from different countries are just like us, also made in the image of God, and that there are some challenges. It's hard. If you've ever done any version of moving to another country, even if it's one that's culturally somewhat similar to what you know, it's hard, especially if you're trying to learn a new language, and maybe you experienced a lot of trauma on your way in. There's all sorts of things that make that a really difficult process. There are also some ways that I think even Chelsea, you've done something like this where you can like sign up with your local library or local organizations to help folks study for their citizenship tests, which are really difficult. And a lot of people born in the U.S. would not pass them. And so helping folks study for those things, helping them if they're learning English, right? Helping them with that as well. And just being like friendly and wanting to learn about people who are different from you, and an increasingly hostile environment where people are experiencing hostility or discrimination when they're heard speaking a non-English language in public or things like that. Also standing up for people in those situations.
Yeah, I mean, and Christians are called to hospitality, and hospitality costs a lot.
Yeah.
Like it requires a lot of the giver, a lot of sacrifice, a lot of things that Christians at least shouldn't argue against. Like that's one of the most biblical kind of ideas, is sacrifice for the sake of hospitality, for the sake of our neighbors.
Yes.
I was going to say something that I love about what Hannah shared, which was just so well thought and so well put, was it's this huge issue, right? We need federal reform, and we've not been able to get it done for decades now. It's this huge, and it can feel overwhelming, and it can feel paralyzing and debilitating. And you think, I'm one person or I'm a small church. What could we ever do to influence that? But maybe the answer is, I'm going to help someone in an ESL class, or I'm going to help someone study for their citizenship exam, or, my aunt volunteers as a translator for people who are new to this country so that they can help navigate this incredibly complicated bureaucratic system. And it's, again, identifying what do I have, what skills do I have, what's available to me, what privileges do I have, and then how do I leverage those things on behalf of others in my local context. Because what happens is, Neil Postman coined this phrase, the information to action ratio. If we take in a lot of information about a topic or a problem that we can't take very much action on, it will just bury us, and we will get compassion fatigue, and we will not be able to do anything. But if we increase the amount of information we take in the same context where we can actually take action, we're able to process those emotions and those feelings so that the compassion is worked out in action, and then we don't feel that fatigue. I think that's actually how we're meant to be as human beings. We're created to be in these kind of close contexts to one another.
Yeah, definitely. Speaking on this issue, when I was working at our small church, Nathan and I actually visited a house called Casa de Paz in, I don't know if you know of it, in Aurora, and it is positioned right next door to an immigration detention facility, which was like super nondescript, but actually huge. And they had to explain to us the whole system of when an asylum seeker, arrives at the border of the U.S. and Mexico, immediately, at least at the time, this was in 2016, detained, and driven somewhere in the country to these detention centers where they had to wait their case. And sometimes that was well over a year. Sometimes, if you were lucky, like you said, it was, within some weeks. But we had no idea that this detention facility was just, probably 5 miles away from where we were. And they said that if you are one of the very few who wins their case, actually is able to stay and continue the process of actual immigration and citizenship, they would, not only are you in a city, seemingly random city, so Denver being, or Aurora technically being one, you're released. They release people at 5 p.m., released with no bus ticket, no meal, card, nothing, no means of transportation, into a city that most people don't know or have any contact with people in any way. This ministry just would go and say, hey, come stay. We'll buy you a bus ticket. Who do you know in the U.S., or if you know anyone, let us help you. But without that, a lot of these asylum seekers would just be on their own completely. No food, no money, nothing. And so that's a way I would encourage anyone to kind of look into, if you're interested in immigration and helping those who are in need. I even think in terms of justice, we're going to have probably a lot of people who lead in really racially homogenous contexts, heavily white contexts in rural churches. I mean, 85% of churches are under 200 people. And a lot of those are in contexts that don't have a lot of people of color. And when people hear the word justice, I think they oftentimes hear, well, that's about people of color, and I don't really have to worry about that. I wanted to actually mention this when we were talking about the payday loans, because that didn't discriminate based on race. It was a lot of impoverished people of all races who were affected and kind of by these predatory loans. There are justice issues that you can engage local government to help everywhere. Doesn't matter where you are. That's something I want to talk about. What are other things people can look out for? It's okay. I know that's a tough question.
It's a really good question though. Do you have anything you want to start with?
Yeah, I think, the context of the conversation, you're right, over the last couple of years in America has been a huge moment of reckoning with racial justice, which is so important. And when you're looking at, okay, what is the core of that argument or of that issue? It's not everyone has the same lived experience in this country, right? And how do we identify and acknowledge how our experiences are different and how some of the systems that we have as part of our society treat people differently throughout time? And one thing that we see both in our current context and then also in the life of Jesus is what you've mentioned earlier, people who have very different lived experience when it comes to wealth and poverty and their experience with access to resources in this country. And so much of the justice conversation that we even saw in the civil rights movement in this country was also linked to the poor, right? The March on Washington, where we have the famous Martin Luther King Jr. speech, is about the People's March. It was advocating for the poor, not just for racial justice. And so we see that in almost every single society and context and neighborhood in this country. And it's about thinking, what resources do we have available to us? And are they being used kind of in an equitable manner? Now, if there are conservatives listening, I'm a conservative, and you might be thinking like, oh, I don't want to like redistribute everything, and oh my goodness. But it's just about having a conversation about, are we doing this in a just manner, or is there corruption? Are there things we could be doing better with our resources? How are we living together? Again, politics and government is how we live together as a community of people. An example is, before I was on city council, I volunteered to serve on a board and commission with our city, and I got put on the budget committee, where as citizens we would evaluate how the city was spending our tax dollars, and then we had the opportunity to speak to the city council and say, we would like you to fund this, we would like you not to fund that. And so we had conversations about what should the funding of our police department be, and what are the things that they could be doing, what's the funding of our grant programs for low-income families. And that's as simple as, that's a justice issue, but we might not always think about it that way, municipal finance and budgeting.
Yeah, I love that. It also makes me think about this question of how do you identify those issues? And I love how you gave this broad framework and kind of said like, hey, addressing issues of injustice is it's not a threat to you. Like, I think so many times we can feel that threat, especially if you've been in a place where the status quo has worked really well for you, and all of a sudden people are talking about change, and you might not have personal relationships with people who are in those situations, right? That moving towards justice is not a threat to your own personal well-being. For somebody else to thrive does not require you to lose something. And so that's something to keep in mind. A lot of times too, rhetoric around these things is going to sort of tap into fear as well. And I think that's important to acknowledge. If you start to feel scared, like if you feel fear at the thought of a certain community of color or from an impoverished community, maybe even in your city, experiencing some support or change, if that feels like a threat to you, you're fearful of that, then you might want to do some like evaluate, like, why is that? Let's explore that further. And I think too, for the folks, I'm just thinking about the folks that you're talking about who maybe are in such homogenous settings where my first thought is like, well, start interacting with people who are from different walks of life. That might be difficult given your geographic context. And so you could think about diversifying the authors that you read, the podcasts you listen to. Are you only reading? There was a time when I realized like, oh my gosh, all the theology books that I'm reading are written by white men and they're awesome books. But maybe I should also incorporate some people who have different lived experiences, because our lived experiences shape the way that we interpret the Bible or view the world or experience the world. And so in order to have a more holistic understanding of society, sometimes it just involves reading a book from a different perspective. There's so many incredible resources out there now that we can access to learn about other people, and slowly but surely, right? People from different backgrounds or from marginalized backgrounds, right, are getting more voice and there's more publications of their work. And so like, start there if you don't know anybody to start with.
Gosh, I love that idea that, if you're reading, I mean, this opens up a whole can of worms on news and information and truth and facts, and it's a gigantic mess. But I love that idea of, if it makes you fearful of losing something, some sort of control, if our outlets are causing fear in us, there's something wrong. And that seems to be what we're trading on, because fear makes a lot of money nowadays.
Yeah. It mobilizes people too really effectively.
Yeah.
And so, fear triggers are not going away anytime soon. And the more that you engage in politics, right, the more familiar you're going to become with those. And so it's just something to be aware of and discerning of as you step further into that public sphere.
Yeah. I think I grew up in a wealthy context, West Austin, lots of money, lots of gates, lots of long driveways and houses on big properties and things like that. And one thing I've been thinking about, another kind of justice issue that has always lurked in the shadows, that now, thank God, is actually coming to light in a lot of ways, is the issue of abuse in general, sexual abuse. We know, if you look at the statistics on this, that abuse does not discriminate. Yet, you look at the foster care system, you look at lots of these other kind of institutional ways to try to combat this. They're disproportionately full of people of color. And that, you can get into a huge rabbit hole, like the foster care system is in a lot of ways a story of oppression in America, all these different things feeding into the need for care. But growing up in a wealthy context, there was, of course, abuse happening. And if anyone thinks there's not because you don't see it, then you need to open your eyes a little bit. When no one is around you, when houses aren't close, when people can't see into other people's lives very well, especially their private life, abuse is happening. And we're starting to see it revealed more thanks to the Me Too movement and other kind of cultural and sociological movements, you could say, that it's happening in schools, it's happening in churches, that it's happening all over the place. And I think talking about local engagement in politics, I've just been made aware actually of a case where the school board knew in this town, and this is unfortunately not the only case, but the school board knew about allegations of abuse of teachers. They would move them around into different schools instead of take on the responsibility to say, this is happening in our schools. You could say the same thing about rape on college campuses. You could, the Boy Scouts, the church, I mean, all of these things, it's coming out that instead of owning and repenting, especially a lot of Christian institutions, the SBC, I mean, it's horrific what's coming out. I'm glad it is, but what I'm trying to say is, this school board was really hiding and in essence, aiding and abetting abusers. The school board is a local elected body. You can affect change on that kind of level. You could run for the school board if you're worried about. Yes. Yeah, we have a person in our church who just got elected to the school board for the sake of our kids and our neighbors. So I think that's another issue that maybe if you're in a wealthier context where these things aren't talked about, these things are hidden in the shadows, this is happening everywhere. There are ways to engage politically. There are ways to acknowledge this in our churches, to repent of it. One of the things that I think we also forget, we look at structural issues, is I've been kind of thinking of this idea, especially privileged people, when we're faced with these issues that scare us, or that things are going to change for us, or we look at the wake of George Floyd, how it just blew up into a national phenomenon. I think one thing that especially the privileged church, big and small and everywhere in between, is really bad at doing is lamenting. Like it's so heavy, we don't want to accept that it's real, because to accept that it's real brings a lot of cognitive dissonance to our lives. It says, there's something I kind of can't control right now. I have a hard time believing that such horrible things are happening to people. So it's a lot easier for me to start to question, well, were they calling for this? There must be more to the story, two sides to every story. We see all these excuses and things. And I just would encourage small church leaders and pastors who are given an opportunity to be more courageous because your platform is a little smaller or a lot smaller, to just say, let's sit in this. There's so many examples in scripture of just mourning and weeping with those who weep. And, you could go on and on about sitting in sackcloth and ashes and just saying, God, even though I wasn't involved in this personally, the way that the people of God have always viewed issues is structural and communal, and saying, we need to come around this. We have enabled this through a variety of ways. So I think it's another kind of justice issue.
Yes, that's huge. I'm so glad you brought that up, that it's so quick, or we can be so quick to, let's find that solution. We got to fix that problem. Or if it's too much, is this barely a problem? To go down that path, but to give space to lament is so, so important. In the church, obviously, we have a strong biblical foundation for what that can look like, and it gives us a place to do that with other people, which I think is an important practice. Something that Michelle Warren taught me, and this was during the summer of 2020. I felt stuck in the lament phase, and I was like, I know we need to do stuff. There's a moment that we need to take. There's movement here, and we can actually make changes, but I feel stuck. And she said, it's really important to give space for lamentation and sit with the problem. She said, you have to sit with the problem in order to come up with an appropriate solution anyway. And it's good to give that space. And so it's a good thing to not just jump right to how do we fix it, but to give space to say the world is not as it should be.
Especially if you're not actually experiencing the injustice.
Especially
You
in
have
case.
to listen, right?
Yes.
And
I think it's important also to remember, man, these are broken systems and they are going to let us down.
Yes.
And our politics will fail us again and again, and our judicial system will fail us because it's imperfect, being run and created by imperfect people. And so it's a reminder for us that these are not ultimate things, that these are not the things where we put our hope or we put our trust. And when we look sometimes at the world, we hear the language, this is the most important election of our lifetime, because for them it might be. Right? Because that is where it is the only thing that they can put their hope in. And so for us, knowing that we have a higher hope is such a gift. And then we live in the tension of two things being true at the same time, that this is an inherently broken system that will fail us. And it's worth our time to try to make better and to use as a tool, one of many, on behalf of the least of these.
It's really well said.
Awesome. I mean, I could keep going for a long time, and I know you could, but I think that's a great place to wrap up. I want to give some more practical kind of ways for small church leaders and people, members and pastors. What are some great resources if they're just breaking into this, or if this has been something they've been interested in for a long time? Any resources that you suggest for people to look into?
Yes. We have lots. We actually curated a list that we can share with you, and you can share as you like.
Yeah, we'll put that
well.
in the show notes.
So one thing, and we'll lift off a few different ways that people can sort of dip their toe in the water or take a next step forward. One, in a church context, could be to do a book study together, or for a small group to go through a book like The Liturgy of Politics by Kaitlyn Schiess, or The Compassion and Conviction by Justin Giboney, Michael Ware, and a third author, Chris Butler, thank you, which is also fantastic and actually has a sort of guide in there for that sort of thing. There's a few other books that we could list off as well, but that could be a great way to read a chapter or two every week and to discuss it with a small group, to learn together, to share your different perspectives, and then as a group, put something into practice. So again, like Chelsea said earlier, you don't have to do this stuff alone, right? Do it with your small group. That sort of reduces the barrier, I think, to entry in a lot of ways.
Yeah, I agree with all the resources that Hannah mentioned, and we'll include many more in the show notes. But I think also, as church leaders and as faith leaders, how to lead individuals in spiritual formation. So it's applying those discipleship practices to this space. And so think about some political practices, some formative practices that you could engage in as a community, whether that's we're going to integrate praying for our leaders into a liturgy, or maybe do a weekly prayer meeting, or start having some of these conversations. I'm always a big advocate of just look up who your elected officials are. You're mentioning school board earlier. I bet most people don't know who's on their school board, right? And especially in a small context, once you look up who they are, you recognize their faces, you commit to say, okay, I'm going to follow them on social media or subscribe to their newsletter. Then I'm going to recognize them when I see them in the grocery store and say hi to them. And you start building that relationship that we've been talking about. Some of those practices, once leaders start doing them, and then you can model and invite your congregation into that as well, you start to build a culture that is opposite to how the world is engaging in politics, and you're really building civic disciples that can then engage in the way of Jesus in a practical way in the community.
Amazing. Thank you both so much. This is amazing.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks so much for having us. It's been so much fun.
Parish Podcast is a production of VineWorks Film Company. The executive producer is Nathan Hoag. This episode was produced, edited, and hosted by Kanan Hurst. Graphic design and set design by Erica Kriesel. Find us on social media at Parish Podcast. Remember to subscribe and rate this podcast wherever you listen. This video podcast has been made possible by the generous support of the Sacred Grace, an incubator and accelerator that's cultivating leaders to take spiritual and social responsibility for their neighbors and neighborhoods. For more information, visit thesacredgrace.com.